The highly popular Bako National Park in Sarawak is an easy trip from Kuching. Because there are no roads into the park, the last part has to be by boat. This one is just departing homeward bound from the park's jetty. What I propose to do now is take a day's walk from here deep into the forest. To one side of the jetty there's a small area of mangroves. About once a week these are visited by this small group of silvered leaf monkeys. At low tide, the ground beneath the mangroves erupts with fiddler crabs. In typical fashion, the males spend much of their time signalling with their large front claw. This probably helps to keep them spaced out as they feed. If purely visual intimidation doesn't work, then a fight will often break out. It's then that the hugely enlarged front claw becomes an offensive weapon rather than a gesturing tool. Fights generally start with just two contestants, but then a third runs in to join the fray. Most battles can hardly be described as hectic. They usually take place in slow motion. In the forest beside the mangroves, I often found large hermit crabs lumbering around. Unlike in most crabs, the body is not armoured. In fact, the abdomen is relatively soft and vulnerable. So the crab adopts a kind of mobile armour in the form of an empty mollusk shell. This stingless bee nest entrance was very close to where I filmed the crab. It's in a typical position on a vertical tree trunk. Like their familiar hive bees, stingless bees are highly social. And their nests also contain large amounts of honey, along with hundreds or even thousands of worker bees. The nest entrance is constructed from resin. It's kept long and narrow in order to make it easily defended against would-be enemies. These hovering sentry bees add to the defence. Stingless bees are much smaller than honeybees. If we go in really close, we can see the white blobs of resin being brought to the nest on the hind legs. Pollen supplies to feed the larvae come in the same way. In the trees above the bees, there was a group of proboscis monkeys. To see my film of them, go to the link at the end of this video. And there's another link to the entertaining life of the bearded pig. On our stroll, we now begin to encounter large clumps of nibong palms. While the upper part of the trunk is smooth, the lower half is heavily defended with very strong, sharp spines. It's April, and many palms bear their tassels of pale yellow flowers. Lower down, the magenta blooms of Melastoma are typical of the tropics. For just a couple of hours each morning, their pollen is harvested by more than one species of green-striped bee. In the centre, there's a much smaller black stingless bee. Once the hot sun fully strikes the flowers, all this activity ceases. Heading across to film a black and white sailor butterfly, I nearly stepped on this bronzeback snake. I later saw several of these within the Bako Park, and they're completely harmless. And I did finally get to film the butterfly. It's one of numerous difficult to identify Neptis species called sailors. The constant wing movement is characteristic. On our walk, we've passed along the top of the beach and are now moving deep into the forest interior. This zone is classified as swamp forest. In many parts of tropical Asia, it's difficult to walk far in a forest before you encounter a column of termites. This living stream is composed of millions of Hospitalitermes workers. They harvest algae and lichens from tree trunks. Studies have shown that these columns tend to utilize protruding structures, such as tree roots, where possible. They only run on the ground itself when it's unavoidable. I'm making a closer inspection, but just look at my shirt. It's wet and shining with sweat. The humidity here is appalling. It was shortly after this that I discovered the snake. In fact, I nearly trod on it. I'm glad I didn't, because my large boots would probably have killed it, or at least severely injured it. It seems to be a twin-barred tree snake, one of the most beautiful snakes in Borneo. Although described as being arboreal, this one seemed to be quite happy on the ground. In typical snake fashion, its forked tongue was constantly flicking in and out. It was presumably trying to detect the scent of prey hidden among the dead leaves. Snakes usually make really tricky subjects. They usually see you before you see them, and off they go. But this strikingly beautiful specimen was amazingly placid. It allowed me to film it for more than half an hour before it finally crawled off into the forest and out of sight. Although venomous, there is little danger to humans from a bite. The head is very small, and the extremely short fangs are placed well back. So only your fingers could be at risk if you picked it up. But even then, the venom is relatively mild. This is also known as the banded flying snake. But it doesn't really fly, it makes extended glides, flattening the body. In Baco, the water in all the ponds and streams is stained brown, but it's still full of life. This tranquil pond is where our walk will terminate. Just look at the nearby shallows seething with tiny fish. I can't figure out how such a small area of water supports such large numbers. What on earth do they all eat? There's little sign of any smaller life. And then, apart from these thousands of small fry, there's the catfish. What do they eat? They presumably have a much larger appetite. So let's leave the fish and switch to a different walk. Take the steep, near vertical climb above the mangroves and you arrive here. On the plateau, there's a special type of dwarf forest called Carengus. The soils are extremely thin and poor and low in nitrogen. This is vital for plant growth. So many of the plants here respond by seeking alternative sources. Of these, the most famous and conspicuous are the pitcher plants. Baco has 4 different kinds. This species with long, narrow pitchers is most common. Here I am in the Carangas, taking a closer look at this plant. Then I move across to a different species with a much larger, more attractive picture. Each one of these is in fact a highly modified leaf. It contains a watery digestive fluid. Insects walking around on the colourful upper lip are at risk. Its surface is designed to be very slick. They slip and tumble into the fluid. Their digested bodies then supply the plant with nitrogen. Pitcher plants benefit from ants by killing them. This ant plant does so by providing them with a home. The hugely swollen base is filled with chambers in which the ants can live a comfortable life. The plant then places itself in a position where it can use its thousands of tiny ant droppings as a source of nitrogen. These ant hotels can reach the size of a small soccer ball. I didn't have to go trekking though. There was plenty of wildlife close to my room. Go along that boardwalk and just out of view on the right there's a tree. And on its trunk, beautifully camouflaged, a flying lemur would sometimes spend the day. In late afternoon, well before it got dark, this male would move to a nearby branch. Note the loose folds of skin around the body as it moves. These are held out flat as it glides from tree to tree, like a flying doormat with a foot on each corner. And yes, it glides, it doesn't fly, despite the name. And it only takes to the air at night, so I didn't film it. This male had a bit of a set routine after waking up. After having a good stretch, he would start grooming. After a lengthy bout of vigorous licking, he took a brief rest. Then he flicked out one corner of his parachute flap and set to work again. Same tree, different date, different flying lemur, a female. And, fortunately for me, she has a baby. In one respect, female flying lemurs are similar to the completely unrelated marsupials. In both cases, the young offspring lives in a pouch on their mother's underside. Flying lemurs aren't really very closely related to anything. There are only 2 species, and this one is restricted to Borneo. One afternoon, from my veranda, I saw a flash of blue directly opposite. It turned out to be a male Asian fairy bluebird, attracted to some berries. A few seconds later, his mate showed up. After less than a minute, they were gone. And just an hour or so later, I was out on the beach watching the sunset's afterglow.